Welcome to the Manna at the Tap podcast and the new liturgical season of Pentecost. Today is Wednesday, May the 22nd, 2024, and I'm Gloria, and I have the pleasure of hosting this podcast. It's a journey of spiritual exploration designed to offer your palate daily manna. It provides a fresh perspective on biblical teachings, allowing you to feast on spiritual food for the soul. We gather the spiritual food from the lectionary readings of the Revised Common Lectionary as provided by Vanderbilt University. These daily readings will expand the range of your biblical knowledge. The lectionary reading for today is Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 to 14, and you may be familiar with it as the African American spiritual song, Dry Bones. Let's examine the context of this narrative and the person who documented it. His name was Ezekiel, which means strength of God. His family had a long lineage of priests, and he desired to follow in their footsteps. But just as he was about to be anointed a priest, they were turbulent times in Judah. The people had rejected God. The mighty Babylonian army was ready to invade the country. Young men like Daniel had been taken into exile, and one would have thought the people would have repented even after such pleading, but they did not. Ezekiel, instead of becoming a priest, became a prophetic voice for God, and he too was exiled and lived among the Jews in Babylon. But oftentimes, when you read his book, his priestly lineage shines through his prophetic voice because he was often concerned with the topics such as the temple, the priesthood, and the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel is grabbed by the hand of the Lord and transported and set down in the middle of an open area that was filled with the bones of those who had died and were left there to be bleached by the sun because there was no one to bury them. This is the same image we have in present day areas of the world where war and famine decimate communities and the dead are left forgotten. The text begins with God's question to Ezekiel. Uh, can these bones live, Ezekiel? What a question. It only evoked doubt in Ezekiel's mind, and he responded, God, only you know that. Ezekiel gives this feeble answer, but God's plan is for Ezekiel to speak to the dry bones and bring the bones to life and proclaim God's message. This can help us deal with the areas of our lives that look like a valley of dry bones with no life and no future. Resurrection is not life like that of a newborn baby. It is renewed life forged from death. Ezekiel must have felt disheartened as he remembered the many opportunities the people had to repent, but they were rebellious against God. Then the mighty king of the Babylonians sealed their fate. He destroyed their temple and took them into exile because there was a broken covenant relationship between God and his people. And what lay in this valley was unspeakable loss. Then God spoke to the dry bones, promising to bring breath to them so that they would come to life. That was all God's doing, and Ezekiel's refrain was, then you will know that I am the Lord. Well, it's interesting that God promised to bring breath to the dry bones, first of all. But we see a switch in the order here. Ezekiel watched as the bones came together with loud rattling and quaking noise, but there was no breath in the bodies that were standing. And the next stage was for Ezekiel to speak to the breath, the wind, and the spirit. This was God's words to Ezekiel. If the dry bones represent those living in exile, then this vision is not concerned about the reality of death, but one of despair. Those living in the diaspora were the survivors, yet they were fearful that God had abandoned them. Ezekiel could offer them a metaphor of the divine presence, the ready availability of breath. And it runs as a thread throughout the lectionary text in these 14 verses. 9 times the word ruach, Ruach, it's the Hebrew word for spirit, breath, and wind. And it's found in our text 9 times. The words all represent the same life-giving force, and it is all from God. This reminds us of Pentecost, when the Spirit came with the wind and the breath into the upper room and filled all the people that were there. The exiles feared they were being cut off from God, and Ezekiel used the breath as a metaphor, reminding them that God's divine presence was as near to them as their breath. Their present circumstances, though difficult, remain the same, but God's breath was a promise of a future. Because God is present, they can breathe. What does this text mean for you and me today? And when do I identify with the valley of dry bones? It's when I feel distant from God. I must remember that every breath I take reminds me that God is that close to me. We are responsible for bringing hope to hopelessness and to hopeless situations and pouring life into dry fields. It can feel at times like an impossible task, but God chooses us to listen to his voice and follow his lead, even though we might be like Ezekiel, filled with doubt and feeling frail. God is the one who brings about the resurrected life. God's ever-present gift of life is as near to us as breathing.